Welcome back to Intelligence at the Edge. I'm your host, Chip Usher. Today is Friday, the 16th of January, and we're providing this emergency podcast to provide a critical update on the evolving situation in Iran, which has been racked by severe protests and a very extreme regime crackdown since the 28th of December. Joining me today is Jonathan Panikoff. Jonathan is currently the director of the Near East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, and prior he was a career intelligence officer. His most notable assignment was as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East, where he served from 2015 to 2020. Jonathan and I were closely together when we were both in service, and I'm really pleased to welcome him today to get perspective on what is driving the protests currently underway in Iran, what we think about the regime's response, and what to expect next. I hope you enjoy the podcast. As always, we welcome your feedback and comments. You can email us at intelattheedge@scsp.ai. Jonathan Panikoff, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
So it is Friday about midday, Friday the 16th of January here in Washington, D.C. We're dropping this emergency podcast to talk about the situation in Iran. And just to briefly recap what I've seen in the last 24 hours is the protests appear to have somewhat subsided. I mean, it's a little hard to tell.
Yeah.
The information coming out of Iran is hard to come by, but reports are indicating probably fewer protests, at least in Tehran, fewer bonfires seen on the streets, fewer security forces out. We'll see if that holds true for other parts of the country. The Iranian government is apparently sticking to its guns, taking a very firm stance. The deputy permanent representative to the United Nations yesterday, in a pretty fiery speech, talked about the protesters as terrorists, warned against foreign intervention. Meanwhile, the United States is continuing to mull various options. The president, publicly said that help is on the way, but apparently, over the last few days, some of the regional states have urged caution with regard to a military strike to give them time to prepare for some sort of Iranian response. So a lot going on, but given your background and experience in this area, you and I worked closely together for a number of years. I thought you would be the perfect person to help our listeners gain a little bit more context and perspective. And to start with, what I would ask you to do is maybe kind of step back a second and explain why these protests are happening now and how they're different from past rounds of protests, because there have been several in recent years, the most recent being the Women Life Freedom protest movement in reaction to the killing of Mahsa Amini in an Iranian prison. So what's driving this round of protests? How's it different?
Look, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. I think you hit it on the head that I think it's right that this round is different. In a couple of ways. First, the Mahsa Amini protests in 2022 were, I think, really being charged by a younger generation that was feeling the social constructs of Iran really creeping in on them to a level that just was so frustrating when they understand where the outside world beyond Iran is looking like. And that includes even in their region, places like the Kingdom that a decade ago had no movie theaters to go to and no people to go to. Now all of a sudden have opened up, and I think the Iranians in a lot of ways, the women are still having a law on head coverings on the hijab and being worn. This round, though, I think is about something else. This is about something much more basic, and that's just the economics of the country as a whole. So we've seen the rial drop, the Iranian currency, to the lowest level that it's been at since the revolution when you adjust for inflation. We've seen food prices soar. We've seen shopkeepers not be able to sell their goods. And I think it's notable, I'm not saying it's going to be directive, but it's notable that just as the 79 revolution, those protests the year before started, frankly, in the bazaars in Tehran, so too did you have the initial protests here on this situation also start in the bazaars. Food shortages because of the pricing is a huge issue. Everybody has to eat no matter who they are,
Right.
the wealthiest to the poorest. There's also some underlying challenges. You still have in the background this social contestation from the Masa Amini protests. You still have a water crisis, especially in Iran, that's getting more and more acute, that Iran as a country is literally running out of sufficient potable water.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of these strands are converging at the same time. And so it's picked up for various reasons, a lot of folks coming out with different priorities about how they think about those various issues, but all coming together now and having protested over these last 10 to 14 days.
And was the impact, in your view, of Israeli-led U.S. participating strikes about 7 months ago against Iran's nuclear infrastructure and against security forces? Did that contribute?
It's interesting because at the time, what you actually did see was some protestations against the action, almost a rallying around not the Iranian flag as it stands and around the regime, but a rallying about Iranian sovereignty. At the same time, what it showed was the emperor has no clothes in some ways. In other words, the Iranian regime has spent billions upon billions of dollars on what was supposed to be massive defense capabilities to prevent the strikes that Israel had from being successful and to prevent the U.S. strikes. Massive billions of dollars to provide for proxy groups throughout the region that was supposed to largely be a first line of defense. And nothing ended up nothing ended up happening that was successful from a defensive posture. And so while at the moment, I think you had a lot of Iranians unhappy that this was a sovereignty violation in their minds, it also reflected what has the revolution brought to them? What has this regime done for them? In other words, at a time when the economy is so bad, it's spending billions of dollars, and it was all unsuccessful in protecting them.
It also seems like the regime has sort of run out of tricks to keep the economy afloat, keep the populace placated through subsidies. I read that they offered a subsidy of $7 a month as a replacement. Fuel prices, the supports there have been taken away. Other price supports have been eliminated. What's your view of the regime's sort of economic approach and how it contributed?
Yeah, look, I think that all plays into this. So there was an actual subsidy that actually upset a lot of the shopkeepers. It also helped to prompt this originally. That was also taken away. Look, the regime has been selling oil on the black market largely to China for years now. But oil prices are continuing to come down. And so while it's good for China, they want to buy it at a further discount. It's even less revenue than they were already having that were coming in. There's been no indication that the basic services the Iranian regime is able to provide and take care of. And I think that's fundamentally underlying all of this, regardless of sector. You're struggling when it comes to jobs. You're struggling when it comes to employment, especially of a younger population. And Iran is a younger country. You're struggling on the social cohesion. You're struggling, frankly, on basic food prices and even substitution of goods that the Iranians are just unable to bring in. That combination now, I think, is fueling a situation where when you combine it with this idea of how they have been spending the money, it's also what they haven't been spending it on. And that's providing any economic relief to the population going on for a number of years now.
So what's your appreciation of how the regime has responded since 28 December when these protests got underway? I mean, it seems they're absolutely being ruthless on the streets. What else are they doing, and how do you rate their likely effectiveness?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to think about it. They're effective so far in that, as you said at the beginning, look, it looks like the protests are starting to diminish and slow down. That doesn't mean they can't start having a resurgence and they can't come back. But the ruthlessness of them, because I think that's the right word, is clearly having an impact on people's willingness to come out, on parents allowing their children to get out of the house, on children seeing their siblings, frankly, shot and killed. We've seen thousands that have been killed. I don't know what the actual numbers are. I think it's going to take us a little while to unravel it. What we do know is that it's way, way above anything we saw with the Women Life Freedom Movement in 2022. And if you go back, say, to the last really political moment in Iran that brought out protests, the Green Revolution of 2009, you had less than 100 protesters killed. And so I think the problem is, in the immediate term, yeah, the regime may have been successful. We're going to find out in the coming days or weeks about suppressing the protests, scaring everyone. But the tactics and the way they've done it and the harshness that they've done it, both in terms of actual violence and in rhetoric. The UN's deputy perm rep in New York yesterday basically called all the protesters terrorists for daring to come out.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be hard to put the genie back in the bottle here a little bit. I actually think we may be at an inflection point with Iran. It's worth remembering that the '79 revolution that brought this regime to power, it actually started the protests in 1978.
Yeah, that's
about
right.
a year
It took
earlier.
a year, right?
You had a number of consistent protests. Look, I think it's going to probably take longer than that in this case, if you were to actually see the regime fall, and we can talk about what that looks like. But I don't know that this isn't the beginning of something, even if the protests end up, petering out in the next couple of weeks completely, as opposed to the end of something.
Gotcha. I thought what we could do next is maybe kind of cast our minds back a little bit and think, to our previous roles in the intelligence community. You were on the National Intelligence Council. I was at CIA looking at the Near East. And were we in those jobs now? What are some of the questions and things that we would be grappling with? And the first thing that leaps to my mind is the need for, reliable information about what is happening on the ground. It seems that there's a lot of things that we don't know. And I think that's probably been true down through the years, trying to assess what's happening on the street in Iran and what's going on with public sentiment, public opinion. What's your view? How do you look at these casualty figures that we're seeing, the number of arrests that are being reported from various outlets? What's your view?
Yeah, I totally agree with you in terms of, I think the question right now is, how do you get access to something that's always been a hard target in terms of getting information? It's not North Korea, so there is access traditionally to the internet, but the fact that the government has cut the internet, I think, is in and of itself a reflection of how concerned the regime actually is at this point.
Yeah, it seems like a move born out of panic.
Absolutely. I think it's a good indicator, though, too, of how challenging they're finding getting the situation under control. And so I think in that way, the question is, look, the U.S. also has not had an embassy in Tehran since the revolution. We have allies who do. Some of them have evacuated their embassies, the Brits, for instance, and so that also makes it harder to get information on the ground. I think the ultimate question becomes, fundamentally, what is the sentiment that is going to actually create a point at which there's no going back? Maybe we're there already, maybe there's not. That's such a granular thing that it's very hard that unless you're actually in country and getting reliable access to information from people, it's really, really challenging, I think, to figure it out. There's no amount of geospatial intelligence, our satellites and imagery, that's going to be able to tell you that. There's maybe communications intercepts, but those are points in specific time that are reflected. And so I think it's difficult to the best of circumstances. Now it's harder. The other side of this, though, is, look, I think things like Starlink are providing some access, even intermittent, to information in a way that the regime is having a harder time controlling. Not impossible, but a harder time. And I think that's where we're going to have to be looking. That's where we're going to be looking to try and say, okay, what technologies can we look at? What technologies can we leverage to try to fill some of these gaps in our information?
The reports that I've seen are that there are upwards of some 50,000 Starlink terminals inside Iran now that have been purchased or smuggled over the
Yeah.
last couple of years, and the regime bans them.
Yep.
But they are small and portable and effective, and for a few $100s, people have been able to import them
Yeah.
or smuggle them in. The regime has tried to block them.
Yeah.
Aware of some technologies that can do that. But what is your view of the effectiveness of the regime kind of blocking Starlink? Can they continue that?
Yeah, I think it's been mixed. So look, I'm a big fan of Starlink, and I recognize it's imperfect. I recognize it can cause some challenges in its use. I fundamentally believe the U.S. and its allies should be doing everything it can to try to get more of these systems in, because it's frankly the only system that's functioning right now to be able to allow information. And I think this is going to be a longer term issue that you're going to want that information, and this can be helpful. At the same time, the Iranians can do some, as you alluded to. There have been door-to-door searches that we've seen go through. Starlink requires, for the communication to the satellites, you can use some detection for RF detection methods to try and get it. There's some questions on jamming that can prevent them but may not be able to geolocate them. Is it a perfect solution? No. It's far from a perfect solution. But I think with Iran as a whole, the question is, what is the best imperfect solutions, multiple, that we can contribute to, or folks should contribute to, or the Iranian people are trying to get access to, that can also benefit us in the West to understand what's really going on?
So again, thinking about our old roles, if you were on the National Intelligence Council right now, and we have a mutual friend who's in the chair. I wish her well. I won't name her, but she's going to have a very busy couple of weeks. What are some of the analytic questions that you would be grappling with right now?
Yeah, I mean, there's three that come to mind, which is, what is the actual stability of the regime? And that question, as you know, as well as anybody, Chip, is sometimes an impossible question to answer. What we're trying to do is trying to play out scenarios as much as anything. And what would be the tipping points to push the regime one way or the other? And what would be the indicators then working backwards that we'd be looking for to get there?
Yep.
So regime stability, obviously, is unsurprisingly number one. The second one is, though, cohesion as well. And I don't just mean cohesion in the political elites in the regime, but cohesion in the military, cohesion in the security services. You know, one of the challenges about economic crises like the regime is facing, and the cost of goods and the rial's, frankly, complete lack of value, is that if you're a lower level to mid-level individual in the guards or in the civil police or in the standing army, that's going to affect you and your family as well. You also have to buy food. You also have a parent who need to be able to have access to potable water and to be able to have access to goods. There's a chance that we've seen this before historically, that those are the types of things that can actually lead to cohesion breaking down, because people understandably start to worry about their own lives and their own family, even beyond an ideological revolution that they may be committed to. The third thing that I'm fundamentally thinking about is, okay, where are our regional partners and allies?
Yeah.
And what does this mean for them? Either if the protests completely diminish, but this is the beginning of something, or if they resurge again, what is the possible outcomes? I think all three of those things our former colleagues, I'd be shocked if they're not grappling with at this very moment.
You spend a lot of time in the region. I know you travel frequently out there. You talk to people nearly every day. What's your read on kind of the regional posture right now? Yeah,
so I was in the Gulf just about a month ago. I was in Doha and Riyadh and Abu Dhabi for meetings, conferences. You know, the situations move so fast that at the time, actually, this wasn't quite on the radar to the same extent that it is now. But when I go back and I talk to people, as I have, and even at the time, you're starting to see a little bit of a split. This came out certainly in Yemen between the Emiratis and the Saudis, but most of the Gulf countries desperately want stability. The Saudis desperately want stability. Fundamentally, I think the Saudis have decided that to accomplish Vision 2030, they're going to need a much more stable reason. They need it for reasons of foreign direct investment. It's why they had a rapprochement with the Iranians to some extent in 2023 that was actually brokered by the Iraqis and the Omanis, but the Chinese took credit. They came in at the last moment. And so I think the Saudis, we've seen some reporting on this very publicly, have been pushing the president, along with the Qataris and the Omanis, the President Trump, to not actually strike Iran, to not actually go forward with what was reported to be real considerations and may still be under consideration of U.S. strikes on the region. The Emiratis, I think, probably have a slightly different view. They actually have a lot of trade with Iran. It's always underestimated what that looks like, but it's much more transactional. And I think the Emiratis are much more skeptical of the regime long term. The bigger question between them, actually, though, I think, is the Israelis. There's obviously reporting now that Prime Minister Netanyahu asked President Trump to not strike right now. I think there's a question about whether that's don't strike right now because we don't have sufficient defenses in place without a U.S. carrier group to help us provide that defense.
And we pulled out the Patriots
after
after last summer, right?
That's right.
Put them back in South Korea.
The 12-day war didn't completely exhaust, but really diminished the Israeli interceptor capacity. There's real challenges, and we moved all our carrier groups out of the region.
Yeah.
There's rumors that Lincoln is now heading back, and I understand that it is from East Asia, but that takes time. So is Netanyahu saying, look, don't strike right now, as in right now because we don't have enough defenses, but in a week or two when you guys are in position, we're happy for you? Or is it don't strike right now, we don't think that this is the right time for this? I don't quite know about this. I think we're all talking to folks and trying to distinguish which it is. I know the Mossad chief, Dave Barnea, is
our friend David
here
Barnea
is
in Florida right now,
exactly.
right, talking to Mr. Witkoff. Well, the other thing that I imagine the IC is doing is responding to or interacting with the policymakers about, U.S. options, right? And let's briefly talk about some of those. And, the president, has not taken the military option off the table, said that help is on the way. His advisors have sort of echoed that. Maybe there's a delay, maybe there's a pause because of requests from Israel or some of the Gulf states. But as you look at what the U.S. can do, sort of how do you tier or organize the suite of options and, your view as to what the risks and benefits would be?
Yeah. Look, I'll start with the one that was kind of on the other side of the house from us in the intelligence community. I want to be very, very clear. I've spoken to nobody in the community.
Right.
I know nothing. I am sure there are considerations underway in terms of what are called Title 50 actions of covert action. Whether they're being executed or deployed, what they are, I have no clue. That's obviously kind of at the lowest tier and the easiest to think through. I think some of the more public actions, though, are going to be what the question is, right? So there's a couple actions that you can take in terms of, can we smuggle in more Starlink systems? Can we use our leverage to actually get access to help provide greater communications abilities, even internally, for protesters to communicate? I'm guessing that's also under consideration. I think there's diplomatic actions that can be considered. I don't know if we have yet. I'm talking to a couple of people trying to figure this out, as I'm sure you are. You can try to take something that is a punitive action that won't have an impact, but in terms of, on the ground, but could have a symbolic one that could, levy the morale of protesters. You could withdraw all of the visas from Iranian students along with your allies across the world, for instance. Most Iranian students are connected to the regime somehow. You have a lot of younger people who are the sons and daughters of high-ranking officials. Do you want to do that as an action? There are obviously diplomatic actions. We can continue to sanction. I'm all for sanctioning. Iran's in one of the most sanctioned countries in the world. How impactful sanctions are going to be at this point,
Right.
I'm slightly skeptical. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I think we should. And then you start getting up higher to kinetic actions. So I think there's kind of two ways to think about that. Kinetically, you can say we're going to do a pinpoint strike. It's not actually to try to change the mission or to change the course of anything. We're actually going to, though, keep our word. President Trump has said very vocally that if you have thousands killed or you have a lot of people killed, we won't stand for that and we will take action. If what he means by that action, I know that there's at least some view that those words did help bring increased protesters to the street. And so I'm concerned that there's actually a credibility issue here at play a little bit. Yeah, if we don't take some sort of action, then will it be a credibility loss among protesters that next time will they not come out as much? But also will the regime look at that, frankly, and say, well, look, in the end, the U.S. backed off. And when you compare it to, say, Venezuela, it reemphasizes they really don't want to be here in the Middle East. They don't care. We can push even further than we have. They're worried about the hemisphere, but they're not going to take the same sort of action.
And what would be the targets of a pinpoint strike?
Yeah, so a pinpoint strike could do a couple of things. One is, look, you could target, I think, Besiege, which is the one of the 5 branches of the Revolutionary Guards, the one that kind of internal control responsibilities. You could target, say, warehouses of their supplies, of their arms, of their small arms. You could target, if you wanted to escalate, naval parts from the guards that are the naval ships that are helping to smuggle weapons to certain proxies. You could target, I think, probably relatively easily, some sort of some of the civil police and other police.
Leadership, command and control.
Well, so the thing is about leadership, once you start going into the leadership side, especially the political leadership side, I think you certainly could, but now we're starting to escalate in terms of the likely reaction and the intensity of that reaction. And I think there's an open question. This kind of gets to the second option I was talking about is, if you're striking leadership, are you also more broadly striking remaining ballistic missile launchers to try to take them offline, as the Israelis did in the summer, to try to prevent more and more launches against Israel in retaliation? Are you trying to hit leaderships that you're actually trying to, say, take out Ayatollah Khamenei, which will prompt bigger actions? Those are all possible. There's a range of actions. It depends what the risk tolerance of the president is and how far he's willing for this to escalate, frankly, in the region. If you really target the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, there's going to be a pretty meaningful reaction. The regime may be in chaos, but what we did see after June of this last year, 2025, is very clearly the guards, the political leadership can recover quite quickly and go down to the next person. I'm not saying it didn't have an impact on command and control, but they can recover.
Gotcha. Just before we end, what are you looking for in the immediate future? What are some of the signpost indicators that you'll be watching?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. One is whether or not the Iranians actually there seems to be, as the protests have diminished, a decrease in deaths as well, whether or not the number being killed re-rises and protests re-rise is going to be a really good indicator about where this is and whether this is going to last or not. I think, obviously, U.S. military action is going to be an indicator, and I think, is the USS Lincoln's movement for deterrence purposes, or is it actually to prepare for an offensive strike into Iran? I think there's a couple of other things. One is, do you get any of the international allies that change their perspectives or their views on what it actually would mean for the U.S. to take a strike into the country and how willing they are to stand by the U.S.? So far, the Gulf allies, as we've talked about, have been very, very against it. Is that going to stay so? I think the other thing to really look for, though, is whether or not you start to see any of the security forces not switch sides, but just kind of stand aside. The 79 revolution is really interesting. People forget that in the end, its success was because there was largely the security forces kind of stood aside and disintegrated into the Iranian social factor.
The cohesion factor.
The cohesion factor, yeah. I think that it's going to be interesting if that happens. And again, it doesn't have to be now. It could be 3 months from now if another protest breaks out, 6 months from now. But that, to me, is the real kind of indicator to look at, because if folks are standing aside, as we were talking about, you generally need, for these types of revolutions, to really succeed in toppling the regime, either somebody to stand aside or somebody to switch sides. I haven't seen any indication of that in a meaningful way yet, but that would be a really big one to look for.
Perfect. Jonathan Panikoff, thanks very much for your time today. Appreciate your insights on Iran. love to have you back on the show, maybe in a couple of weeks when we see what happens, talk about Iran and the broader region.
Look forward to it. Thanks so much for having me.
All right.